The morning routine never changed. Margaret Thompson arranged the roses first, then the carnations, each stem cut to the exact same length. Her weathered hands moved with surgical precision, fingers that had once held different instruments entirely. The flower shop on Maple Street looked ordinary enough: pastel walls, handwritten price tags, the gentle hum of refrigeration units. But beneath the counter, hidden behind a false panel, lay documents that would make the Pentagon's most classified files look like grocery lists. For 12 years, she had been just another face in the neighborhood. A quiet woman who knew everyone's favorite flowers and never forgot an anniversary. What the townsfolk of Millbrook didn't know was that those same gentle hands held the record for the most confirmed long-range eliminations in modern military history. 847 names, each one earned from distances that would make a mathematician question the curvature of the earth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The brass wind chimes above petals and stems caught the morning breeze, their melody drifting across the empty street as Margaret unlocked the front door. 6:15 in the morning, same as always. The town of Millbrook was still wrapped in that peculiar silence that comes just before dawn breaks completely. When the streetlights haven't quite decided whether to give up their vigil and the first coffee shops are just beginning to show signs of life, Margaret stepped inside her sanctuary, breathing in the mixture of earth and sweetness that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. The refrigerated cases hummed quietly, their glass surfaces fogged with condensation that caught the first rays of sunlight filtering through the storefront windows. She moved through her domain with the kind of efficiency that comes from 12 years of identical mornings. But there was something else in her movements, a precision that spoke of different kinds of training, muscle memory that went deeper. Then flower arrangement. She began with the roses, as always. Red ones first, then white, then the pale pink ones that Mrs. Henderson always bought for her daughter's grave on Thursdays. Each stem received the same treatment, a diagonal cut exactly 1 3/4 inches from the bottom, made with a blade kept sharp enough to slice paper. Margaret's fingers found the thorns automatically, removing them with quick, practiced movements that never drew blood. Her hands were steady, unnaturally steady for a woman of 53, who had supposedly spent her entire adult life in retail. Carnations came next. White ones with their ruffled edges that reminded her of dress shirts. Red ones that looked almost too bold for the quiet sensibilities of Millbrook. She trimmed each stem to precisely 14 inches, arranging them in the tall glass vases that caught the morning light. The movements were meditative, rhythmic, but underneath the calm exterior was a mind that never stopped calculating. Distance to the door, angles of approach, exit routes, line of sight from the storage room window to the post office across the street. These weren't conscious thoughts anymore. They were as automatic as breathing, remnants of a life that Margaret Thompson, the flower seller, had supposedly never lived. But they were there, persistent and sharp, like scar tissue that ached before a storm. The bell above the door announced her first customer of the day. Harold Peterson, 72 years old, retired machinist, walked with a slight limp from a factory accident 15 years prior. His wife Patricia had developed a fondness for yellow tulips in her final years, and even though she'd been gone for 8 months now, Harold still bought a dozen every Tuesday and Friday. Margaret had his order ready before he finished shuffling to the counter. "Morning, Harold," she said, her voice carrying the warmth that had made her a beloved fixture in the community. "The tulips are particularly lovely today. Got them in fresh from the distributor yesterday evening." Harold nodded, his fingers working to extract his worn leather wallet from his back pocket. "Patricia always said you had the best eye for flowers." "In 3 counties," he said, the same thing he'd said for the past 8 months. She could spot quality from across the room. Margaret wrapped the tulips in brown paper with the same care she'd shown the stems themselves. Her fingers worked quickly, efficiently, creating neat hospital corners and securing the bundle with twine. But her eyes had already catalogued every detail of Harold's appearance. The slight tremor in his left hand hadn't been there 2 weeks ago. The way he favored his right side more than usual. The small bandage on his neck, partially hidden by his collar. Details that meant nothing to anyone else but painted a complete picture for someone trained to see them. "You take care of yourself, Harold," she said, handing him his change along with the flowers. "And don't forget that doctor's appointment on Thursday." He paused, slightly surprised. "How did you remember that?" Margaret smiled. "It's my job to remember the important things." As Harold shuffled back toward the door, Margaret's attention had already shifted to the street outside. A white sedan had been parked across from the bank for the past 7 minutes. The driver hadn't gotten out, hadn't opened a newspaper, hadn't pulled out a phone, just sitting. In 12 years of flower selling, Margaret had learned that people who sat in cars without purpose were worth watching. The morning continued its predictable rhythm. Susan Martinez arrived at 7:30 for the weekly arrangement for her dental office, something bright and professional, usually involving daisies and baby's breath. She was followed by Tom Bradley, who owned the hardware store and bought a single red rose every Wednesday. To surprise his wife of 37 years, Margaret served each customer with the same attentive care, the same genuine interest in their lives and stories. She remembered birthdays, anniversaries, the names of grandchildren, the preferred colors for different occasions. This wasn't an act or a cover story. The genuine affection was real. Over 12 years, these people had become her people, their joys and sorrows as important to her as her own. But beneath the surface, another part of her mind remained active. The white sedan had moved twice, circling the block in a pattern that would allow its occupant to observe the flower shop from different angles. The man who'd bought coffee from Fletcher's Cafe had positioned himself at a window table with a direct view of her storefront, and his newspaper hadn't been turned to a new page in 23 minutes. These observations came as naturally as breathing, automatic assessments that Margaret made without conscious effort. The friendly flower seller and the ghost of someone else entirely coexisted in the same body, the same hands that arranged roses having once held instruments designed for entirely different purposes. By 9 o'clock, the morning rush had settled into the quieter pace that marked the middle hours of the day. Margaret used this time for inventory, checking her supplies, making notes for orders that would need to be placed with her distributors. She worked in the back room, where the industrial refrigeration units hummed and the concrete floor showed water stains from years of flower preparation. It was here, surrounded by buckets of stems and the earthy smell of plant food, that Margaret kept her other life contained. Behind a false panel in the storage closet, sealed in waterproof containers, were documents that told a different story. Service records, commendation letters, photographs of places that didn't appear on civilian maps. And most significantly, a meticulously maintained logbook with 847 entries, each one noting a date, a location, a distance, and a set of initials. Margaret never looked at those documents during business hours. That life existed in a separate compartment, sealed away like radioactive material. But she was aware of them constantly, the way a person might be aware of their own heartbeat, present, persistent, impossible to ignore completely. The bell chimed again, and Margaret looked up to see Detective Ray Morrison from the Millbrook Police Department. Ray was a regular customer, buying flowers for his wife's garden and occasionally for the small memorial services that marked the passing of the town's older residents. But today he looked different. His usual easy smile was strained, and he carried himself with the kind of tension that came from delivering bad news. "Morning, Margaret," he said, but the greeting felt heavy. "I need to ask you about something, if you have a minute." Margaret wiped her hands on her apron, noting the slight tightness around Ray's eyes. The way his hand rested near his radio, the fact that he'd parked his cruiser where it blocked the side exit from her shop. "Of course, Ray, what's on your mind?" "We had some federal agents come through town yesterday," he said, watching her face carefully. "They were asking questions about residents who might have military backgrounds. Looking into some kind of security matter, they said." Margaret's expression didn't change, but every nerve in her body had suddenly become hyper-aware. "That sounds serious. I hope there's no trouble." "The thing is," Ray continued, "they specifically asked about you. Wanted to know about your background. When you moved to town, that sort of thing. I told them you were just about the most harmless person in Millbrook, but they seemed pretty interested in talking to you. The white sedan, the man at Fletcher's Cafe, the questions about her background." Margaret felt the familiar sensation of pieces clicking into place, the way they had in another life when intelligence reports painted pictures of impending danger. But her voice remained steady, curious without being alarmed. "That's strange," she said. "I can't imagine why anyone would be interested in a flower shop owner." "Did they say what kind of security matter?" Ray shook his head. "They were pretty close-mouthed about it. But Margaret, if there's anything you think I should know anything at all, now would be a good time to tell me." Margaret met his eyes directly, the same way she'd looked at customers for 12 years. "Ray, I've been selling flowers in this town for over a decade. The most dangerous thing I've ever done is forget to water the orchids." But even as she spoke the words, Margaret's mind was already 3 steps ahead, calculating possibilities, assessing threats, preparing for contingencies she hoped would never be necessary. The life she'd built in Millbrook, the genuine life, full of real relationships and honest work, suddenly felt as fragile as the stems she arranged each morning. Ray seemed to accept her answer, but Margaret could see he wasn't entirely convinced. After he left, she stood in her shop surrounded by the beauty and peace she'd cultivated for 12 years, and wondered if the careful balance she'd maintained was about to be shattered by truths too dangerous to remain buried. Outside, the white sedan drove past again, slower this time. Margaret didn't look directly at it, but she saw everything: the license plate, the antenna configuration that suggested sophisticated communication equipment, the way the passenger window was positioned for optimal observation. For 12 years, Margaret Thompson had been exactly who she appeared to be: a quiet woman who brought beauty into people's lives through flowers, who remembered their special occasions, who offered comfort in times of loss. But she had also been someone else. Entirely, someone whose skills had made her invaluable to her country and terrifying to its enemies. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Now, as she arranged the afternoon's display of Lily with hands that had never lost their steadiness, Margaret realized that these 2 versions of herself might soon be forced to meet. And when that happened, the quiet town of Millbrook would learn that sometimes the most dangerous people are those who choose to live the most ordinary lives. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the storefront windows when Margaret noticed the second anomaly. A woman in a navy business suit had been examining the jewelry display in Chen's Antiques across the street for 43 minutes. In Margaret's experience, nobody spent that long looking at vintage brooches unless they were conducting surveillance. The woman's reflection in the antique shop's window gave her a perfect line of sight to petals and stems, and she'd positioned herself behind a tall cabinet that provided natural cover. Margaret continued, arranging the afternoon's special display, a collection of autumn flowers that Dr. Sarah Webb had ordered for her medical practice. The bronze chrysanthemums and deep red dahlias required careful balance, each bloom positioned to complement the others while creating an overall impression of warmth. Her fingers worked automatically, muscle memory guiding the placement while her mind processed the tactical situation developing around her quiet shop. The federal agents, Ray mentioned weren't just asking questions anymore. They were actively watching her, and their methods suggested a level of sophistication that went beyond routine background checks. Margaret had spent enough years in the intelligence community to recognize a full surveillance package when she saw one. The white sedan, the newspaper reader at Fletcher's Cafe, the woman in the antique store, these weren't coincidences. "Mrs. Thompson?" A voice interrupted her thoughts. Margaret turned to see Emma Richardson, 16 years old, part-time employee. At the grocery store, standing nervously in the doorway. Emma usually radiated teenage confidence, but today she seemed genuinely unsettled. "What is it, sweetheart?" Margaret asked, setting down her scissors and giving Emma her full attention. Over the years, she'd learned that teenagers only sought out adults when something was genuinely wrong. "There were these people asking about you at Morrison's Market," Emma said, glancing nervously toward the street. "Two men in suits. They wanted to know about your routine, what time you open and close, whether you ever travel outside of town." Mr. Morrison told them it was none of their business, but they kept pushing. It was weird. Margaret felt her chest tighten, but her voice remained calm and reassuring. "That does sound strange. Did they say why they were asking?" "They claimed to be conducting some kind of community survey, but they only asked about you." "And Mrs. Thompson?" Emma stepped closer, lowering her voice. "One of them had a gun. I saw it when his jacket opened." "What kind of survey people carry guns?" "The kind that aren't really conducting surveys," Margaret thought. She placed a gentle hand on Emma's shoulder, noting how the teenager's pupils were slightly dilated with stress, her breathing shallow. "You did the right thing telling me about this, Emma. If anyone else approaches you with questions about me or anyone else in town, you don't have to answer them. Just walk away and tell a trusted adult, okay?" Emma nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "Mrs. Thompson, are you in some kind of trouble?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Margaret couldn't fully address. How do you tell a 16-year-old that you might be in the kind of trouble that doesn't get resolved by lawyers or community mediation? How do you explain that sometimes the past doesn't stay buried, no matter how carefully you've built your new life? "I hope not," Margaret said finally. "But Emma, I want you to do me a favor. For the next few days, if you see anything unusual around the shop, people watching, strangers asking questions, anything that doesn't feel right, I want you to stay away. Can you do that for me?" Emma's eyes widened. "You think something's going to happen?" "I think it's better to be cautious," Margaret replied. "And Emma, don't mention this conversation to anyone else. Not your friends, not your parents, not anyone. Sometimes the safest thing is to keep quiet about what you've seen." After Emma left, Margaret locked the front door and flipped the sign to closed, even though it was only 3:30. She moved through the shop methodically, checking sightlines from every window, noting potential cover positions, assessing the structural integrity of walls and furniture. These weren't conscious decisions. Her training had never really left her, dormant skills awakening like muscle memory. In the back room, she activated the small television that she kept for background noise during inventory work, but instead of her usual cooking shows or local news, Margaret found herself cycling through news channels, looking for stories that might explain why federal agents were suddenly interested in a flower shop owner in rural Pennsylvania. The international news painted the usual picture of global instability, tensions in Eastern Europe, ongoing conflicts in the Middle East, cybersecurity threats against critical infrastructure. But buried in a brief report from CNN was a detail that made Margaret's blood run cold. Intelligence sources report that classified military records may have been compromised in a recent data breach, potentially exposing the identities of covert operatives who have been living under assumed identities. Margaret turned off the television and sat in the silence of her shop, surrounded by the tools of her trade and the life she'd built from nothing. 12 years ago, she'd made a deal with people whose names never appeared in newspapers. New identity, new life, complete separation from her past, in exchange for her silence about operations that officially never happened. The arrangement had protected both sides. She got to disappear, and they got to maintain plausible deniability about activities that might embarrass certain allied governments. But if classified records had been compromised, if her real identity and operational history were now in the hands of hostile intelligence services, then the careful balance that had protected her for over a decade was about to collapse. And the people who had once relied on her skills might now see her as a liability that needed to be eliminated. Margaret walked to the storage closet and knelt beside the false panel she'd installed 3 years after moving to Millbrook. Inside the hidden compartment were the tools of her former trade: encrypted communication devices, untraceable credit cards under various names, detailed maps of extraction routes, and weapons that had never been registered with any civilian authority. She hadn't looked at these items in almost 2 years, but they remained as she'd left them, cleaned, maintained, ready for immediate use. At the bottom of the cache was a phone that connected to a number she'd hoped never to dial again. Margaret held the device, weighing her options. Making contact would confirm her location to people who might already be looking for her. But staying silent might mean missing critical intelligence about the scope of the security breach and the level of threat she was facing. She powered on the phone and waited. It connected automatically to an encrypted satellite network, bypassing all local cellular infrastructure. The number rang 3 times before a voice answered, emotionless, professional, speaking in a code phrase that hadn't changed in 12 years. Garden Center, the voice said. "This is Orchid," Margaret replied, using her old operational call sign. "I need to speak with the greenhouse manager." "Orchid has been inactive for 11 years, 7 months, the voice responded. "This line is not authorized for civilian use." "Check your morning briefings," Margaret said. "Someone's been asking questions about the flower arrangement business in small towns. I think my cover might be compromised." There was a pause, long enough for Margaret to imagine data being accessed, files being cross-referenced, threat assessments being updated in real time. When the voice returned, it carried a different tone: urgent, concerned. "Orchid, you need to relocate immediately. There's been a security incident. Multiple assets may be exposed." "How bad?" Margaret asked, though she was already mentally preparing for the worst-case scenario. "Bad enough that we're initiating Phoenix protocols for anyone on the compromised list. Transportation will be available at Checkpoint 7 in 90 minutes. Bring only essentials. Phoenix protocols." Margaret closed her eyes. That was the nuclear option: complete identity erasure, relocation to a different continent, severance of all existing relationships. Everything she'd built in Millbrook would simply cease to exist, as if Margaret Thompson had never lived there at all. "Negative," she said. "I have responsibilities here. People who depend on me." The voice on the other end became sharp, authoritative. "Orchid, this is not a negotiation. Your operational history makes you a high-value target. If hostile assets have your location, they won't hesitate to eliminate you. And they won't care about collateral damage to your civilian contacts." The threat to innocent people in Millbrook hit Margaret harder than any concern for her own safety. Harold Peterson buying his weekly tulips. Emma Richardson learning about life and responsibility. Dr. Webb and her medical practice. Tom Bradley surprising his wife with roses. These weren't just customers. They were the community that had given her life meaning after years of existing in the shadows. "How long do I have?" she asked. "Based on current intelligence, perhaps 24 hours before they make their move. Maybe less if they've already positioned assets in your area." Margaret thought about the surveillance she'd detected, the pattern of inquiries, the systematic way her cover was being probed. "They're already here," she said. Multiple teams, coordinated surveillance, professional-grade equipment. Then, "You're out of time," the voice replied. "Checkpoint 7, 90 minutes. Don't make us come looking for you." The line went dead. Margaret stared at the phone for a long moment, then carefully powered it down and returned it to its hiding place. She had a decision to make, and neither option offered the kind of ending she'd hoped for when she'd chosen to become Margaret Thompson. Small-town flower seller. She could run. Disappear into the extraction system that had been designed to protect assets like her. Live the rest of her life under another name, in another place, building another carefully constructed identity while always looking over her shoulder. It would be safe, sterile, and utterly empty of the genuine human connections that had made the past 12 years worth living. Or she could stay and fight. Use the skills that had made her legendary in covert operations to protect the life and community she'd built. But staying meant putting innocent people at risk, turning the peaceful streets of Millbrook into a battlefield where the rules of engagement wouldn't protect civilian bystanders. Margaret stood in her shop, surrounded by the beauty she'd cultivated and the life she'd chosen, and realized that sometimes there are no good options, only necessary ones. Outside, the shadows were growing longer, and somewhere in those shadows, people with orders to eliminate her were preparing to move. She had until morning to decide whether Margaret Thompson would run, fight, or find a third option that might somehow preserve both her life and the community she'd grown to love. But first, she had to prepare for the possibility that the quiet flower seller from Millbrook might need to become someone else, entirely someone the government had tried very hard to forget existed. Margaret opened petals and stems at 5:30 the next morning, 2 hours earlier than usual. The pre-dawn darkness provided cover as she moved through the shop, but it also concealed potential threats she couldn't identify. Her decision had crystallized during the sleepless night. She wouldn't run. Whatever was coming to Millbrook, she would face it here, among the people and places that had become her real life. The emergency preparations had taken most of the night. She'd relocated her hidden cache to 3 different positions throughout the building, creating redundant access points to weapons and equipment. The flower coolers had been repositioned to provide cover and concealment. Most importantly, she'd activated a series of silent alarms that would alert key people in town if the situation escalated beyond her control. At 6:15, Margaret's phone rang. Not the encrypted device, but her regular cell phone with the cheerful ringtone that customers knew well. The caller ID showed Dr. Sarah Webb's home number. "Margaret, I'm so sorry to call this early." Sarah's voice was tight with worry. "But I needed to warn you about something. I was leaving the hospital last night after a late surgery, and I saw 2 men watching your shop from the parking lot behind Fletcher's Cafe. They had night vision equipment and what looked like long-range cameras." Margaret felt her pulse quicken, but kept her voice calm. "Thank you for telling me, Sarah. Did they see you?" "I don't think so. I parked behind the medical building and observed them for about 20 minutes. Margaret, these weren't local law enforcement. They moved like military personnel, and their equipment was definitely not standard police issue." "I appreciate you looking out for me," Margaret said. "But Sarah, I need you to promise me something. If you see any unusual activity around town today, strangers, unmarked vehicles, anything that doesn't feel right, I want you to take your family and visit your sister in Pittsburgh. Make it look like a routine family trip." There was a pause. "Margaret, what's going on? Are you in danger?" "I hope not," Margaret replied. "But I'd rather have you safe and disappointed than sorry and too late." After ending the call, Margaret began her morning routine with mechanical precision, but every movement served a dual purpose. Arranging flowers provided cover for checking sight lines and potential firing positions. Filling water buckets allowed her to verify that emergency equipment remained accessible. Loading the cash register gave her an excuse to ensure the panic button she'd installed years ago was still functional. At 7:45. The first shot shattered the peaceful morning. It wasn't aimed at Margaret. It was a sniper's bullet that punched through the front tire of Ray Morrison's police cruiser as he pulled into his usual parking spot in front of the municipal building. The detective's vehicle lurched sideways, striking a fire hydrant with enough force to deploy the airbags. Ray stumbled out of the wreckage, dazed but alive. Just as a second shot sparked off the concrete steps behind him, Margaret was already moving before the echoes faded. She'd been expecting an approach under cover of darkness or the chaos of a staged emergency. Instead, they were opening with precision fire in broad daylight, using the element of surprise to control the initial engagement. It was a bold tactical choice that suggested either supreme confidence or desperate urgency. The flower shop's front windows exploded inward as a burst of automatic weapons fire raked across the storefront. Margaret had already dropped behind the reinforced counter she'd modified 3 years earlier, her hand closing around the grip of a pistol she'd hoped never to use again. Glass cascaded around her like deadly rain, the sound mixing with the screams of early morning pedestrians caught in the crossfire. Mrs. Henderson, 78 years old, had been walking her small terrier when the shooting started. Margaret saw her freeze in the middle of Maple Street, too terrified to move as bullets snapped through the air around her. Without thinking, Margaret vaulted over the counter and sprinted into the street, her body low, moving in the serpentine pattern that had kept her alive in 3 different war zones. She reached Mrs. Henderson in 4 seconds, wrapped her arms around the elderly woman, and carried her behind the solid bulk of a parked delivery truck. The terrier, a small white dog named Buttons, was barking frantically but appeared uninjured. Margaret pressed Mrs. Henderson against the truck's rear wheels and spoke rapidly in her ear. "Stay down, stay quiet, and don't move until I come back." "For you," Margaret said. "If shooting starts again, crawl under the truck and stay there." Mrs. Henderson's eyes were wide with shock, but she managed to nod. Margaret squeezed her shoulder once, then began moving toward the source of the gunfire. The shooters had positioned themselves in 2 locations, the roof of Chun's Antiques and the second floor of the building that housed Fletcher's Cafe. Classic Overwatch positions that provided elevated fire lanes covering most of Maple Street. They'd chosen their ground well, but they'd made one critical error. They'd assumed their target was just a civilian who would cower and wait for rescue. Margaret reached the alley behind the antique store and began climbing. The building's rear wall offered hand and footholds that wouldn't have been obvious to most people, but Margaret had noted them years ago as part of the mental mapping she did automatically in any environment. The brick was old but solid, the mortar joints providing sufficient grip for someone with the right training. She reached the roof edge in less than 30 seconds. The sniper was positioned 15 feet away, prone behind a makeshift barrier of ventilation equipment, his attention focused on the street below. He was good. His rifle was a military-grade precision weapon. His shooting position was textbook perfect, and his equipment suggested extensive professional training. But he'd made the same mistake as his commanders. He'd assumed Margaret Thompson was just a small-town flower seller. Margaret's approach was silent, her footsteps masked by the sounds of continuing gunfire from the cafe building. She reached the sniper's position while he was acquiring a new target, his eye pressed to the scope, finger taking slack out of the trigger. Her hand closed over his mouth as her knife found the gap between his tactical vest and helmet, a precise insertion that ended the threat instantly and silently. The sniper's rifle was still warm, the scope calibrated for the exact range to key positions on Maple Street. Margaret checked the weapon's condition, verified the ammunition count, and settled into the firing position the dead man had prepared. Through the scope, she could see the second sniper's position on the cafe building, approximately 200 meters away, an easy shot for someone with her capabilities. The crosshairs settled on the target's center mass. Margaret's breathing slowed. her heart rate dropping into the focused state that had made her legendary among the intelligence community. Her finger found the trigger, took the slack, and prepared to fire. Then she saw Emma Richardson, the teenager, was pressed against the side of Morrison's Market, trapped in the open by the crossfire, tears streaming down her face as she tried to make herself invisible against the brick wall. The second sniper was tracking toward her position, his rifle swinging in a slow arc that would bring Emma into his field of fire in seconds. Margaret's shot took the man in the upper chest, the impact spinning him away from his rifle and sending him tumbling from the roof. The sound of his body hitting the pavement echoed across the suddenly quiet street, and Margaret realized that the gunfire had stopped entirely. She remained motionless, scanning for additional threats, her finger still on the trigger. But the silence stretched on, broken only by the distant sound of sirens as emergency responders finally approached the scene. It seemed impossible that only two shooters had created so much chaos, but Margaret's tactical instincts were screaming that something was wrong with the entire scenario. Professional assassins didn't operate in broad daylight in small American towns. They didn't use precision rifles to shoot out tires or spray automatic fire at storefronts. The attack had been designed to create maximum noise and confusion while minimizing actual casualties, more like a distraction than a genuine elimination attempt. Margaret's blood went cold as the implication hit her. This wasn't the main attack. It was a diversion designed to draw her out of cover, to force her to reveal her capabilities and position. Somewhere else in Millbrook, the real threat was moving into position while all attention was focused on Maple Street. She grabbed the dead sniper's radio, switching it to scan mode. Almost immediately, voices crackled through the speaker. Professional, clinical, coordinating movement toward a secondary target. Margaret's hands clenched around the device as she heard the address, 247 Oak Street, the location of Millbrook Elementary School, the school where Emma Richardson's younger brother attended 3rd grade, where Harold Peterson's granddaughter was in kindergarten, where dozens of innocent children were gathered in classrooms, completely unaware that they'd become pawns in a game designed to force Margaret into an impossible choice. She could try to reach the extraction point and disappear, leaving the town to face whatever consequences her presence had brought. Or she could go to the school and confront the real attack, knowing that doing so would confirm everything the intelligence services suspected about her identity and capabilities. Margaret looked down at Maple Street, where people were beginning to emerge from cover, where Mrs. Henderson was being helped to her feet by a paramedic, where Emma Richardson was finally able to run to safety. These weren't strategic assets or acceptable losses. They were her neighbors, her friends, the people who'd given her life meaning. After years of existing in the shadows of classified operations, she secured the sniper rifle and began moving toward Oak Street, knowing that the quiet flower seller was about to become someone else entirely. The school was 12 blocks away, and based on the radio chatter, she had perhaps 10 minutes before the real attack began. For the first time in 12 years, Margaret Thompson was going to war, not for flag or country or classified objectives, but for the simple right of innocent people to live their lives without becoming collateral damage in games played by people who viewed human beings as disposable resources. The woman who climbed down from the roof of Chun's Antiques was no longer just a small-town shopkeeper. She was Orchid, the ghost operative whose official record listed 847 confirmed eliminations, and she was about to remind everyone who'd forgotten exactly why that number had made her the most feared sniper in the history of covert operations. Margaret moved through the residential streets of Millbrook like a ghost, the sniper rifle slung across her back, her mind automatically calculating angles, distances, and timing. The radio chatter from the dead operative's equipment painted a clear picture. 6-man assault team, military-grade weapons, explosive charges sufficient to breach classroom doors. They were positioned in 3 vehicles around Millbrook Elementary, waiting for some predetermined signaled to begin their assault. The school sat on a 5-acre lot at the intersection of Oak Street and Willow Avenue, surrounded by open playground areas that would normally provide children space to run and play. Now those same open spaces represented killing fields with minimal cover for anyone caught outside the building. Margaret could see the target team's vehicles from her position, behind the maintenance shed of the Lutheran Church, 2 black SUVs, and a white panel van arranged to control all exit routes from the school property. She keyed the radio she'd taken from the rooftop sniper, listening to the coordination between team leaders. Their voices were professional, calm, completely devoid of emotion as they discussed positioning explosive charges near the gymnasium, where the kindergarten and first-grade classes were having their morning assembly. These weren't soldiers following rules of engagement. They were contractors who viewed children as leverage points in a larger strategic operation. The school's morning routine was proceeding normally, completely unaware of the threat gathering around them. Margaret could see Principal Janet Foster through the main office windows, talking on the phone with her usual animated gestures. Third-grade teacher Amanda Walsh was leading her class in their daily flag pledge, the children's voices carrying faintly across the playground. Somewhere in that building, Emma Richardson's 8-year-old brother Tyler was probably working on his multiplication tables, worried about nothing more serious than the spelling test scheduled for Friday. Margaret's hands tightened around the rifle. In her operational past, she'd been required to make cold calculations about acceptable losses, to weigh strategic objectives against civilian casualties. But those decisions had been made in war zones, in situations where everyone understood the risks. This was different. This was using innocent children as bait to force a retired operative out of hiding, and it crossed every line that separated legitimate intelligence work from terrorism. She activated her personal cell phone and dialed the school's main number. Janet Foster answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the same cheerful efficiency that had made her a beloved figure in the community for 15 years. Millbrook Elementary, this is Janet. Janet, this is Margaret Thompson from the flower shop, Margaret said, keeping her voice steady despite the urgency of the situation. I need you to listen very carefully and do exactly what I tell you without asking questions. Margaret, you sound strange. Is everything all right? Janet, there are armed men surrounding the school. You need to initiate a lockdown immediately, and you need to move all the children away from the gymnasium and any exterior windows. There was a pause. Then Janet's voice became sharp and focused, the tone of an educator who'd been trained for exactly this type of emergency. Are you certain about this? I'm looking at them right now, Margaret said. 3 vehicles, at least 6 men with military weapons. Call 911, but don't wait for the police response. Get those children to the safest interior rooms you have. And do it now. We're initiating a lockdown, Janet said, and Margaret could hear her already reaching for the intercom system. Margaret, where are you? Are you safe? I'm going to try to slow them down, Margaret said. But Janet, no matter what happens, don't let anyone leave that building until law enforcement gives you the all clear. Margaret ended the call and immediately began moving toward the white panel van, which sat closest to the school's main entrance. Through the radio chatter, she'd learned that this vehicle contained the team's communications equipment, and explosive charges eliminating it would disrupt their coordination and prevent them from breaching the reinforced doors that were standard in modern school construction. The van was parked behind a cluster of oak trees that provided concealment from the school, but also created blind spots that Margaret could exploit. She approached from the north side, moving through Mrs. Patterson's backyard and using a garden shed as cover for the final 50 meters. The driver remained in the vehicle, monitoring radio traffic, while his partner had moved to the tree line. With a clear view of the school's front entrance, Margaret's knife was designed for silence, a ceramic blade that wouldn't trigger metal detectors and would penetrate tactical armor at close range. She reached the lookout's position while his attention was focused on the school building. The elimination was quick and silent, professional training taking over as she neutralized the threat and acquired his radio and weapon. Through the dead man's scope, she could see the school's interior lights shifting as classrooms entered lockdown mode. Teachers were pulling blinds, herding children away from windows, following emergency protocols that had been drilled but never tested under real conditions. The sight of those small figures moving to safety filled Margaret with a determination that transcended her years of retirement from active operations. The van's driver was still monitoring communications, unaware that his partner had been neutralized. Margaret approached the vehicle from behind, using the sound of idling engines to mask her footsteps. The driver's window was partially open, and she could hear him coordinating with the other teams, discussing timing for the assault that was scheduled to begin in less than 4 minutes. Margaret's approach was textbook perfect, a swift, silent neutralization that left her in control of the communications hub and explosive materials. She quickly assessed the equipment in the van: radio systems connected to encrypted networks, plastic explosives configured for breaching operations, and detailed floor plans of the school building that showed classroom locations, ventilation systems, and structural weak points. But most importantly, she found the master control device for what appeared to be a much larger operation than just the school assault. The screen showed locations throughout Millbrook, the fire department, the police station, the medical clinic, even her own flower shop. Each location was marked with timer displays counting down toward 0, suggesting a coordinated series of attacks designed to overwhelm the town's emergency response capabilities. Margaret realized she wasn't just facing an assassination attempt, she was looking at a full-scale assault on Millbrook itself, using the school as the primary target to ensure she would engage. Once she revealed her operational capabilities by defending the children, secondary attacks would eliminate local law enforcement and medical facilities, leaving the town completely vulnerable while media attention focused on the school shooting. She grabbed the radio and began broadcasting on the frequency the assault teams were using, her voice calm and professional as she delivered information that would fundamentally change their tactical situation. "All units, this is Orchid," she said, using her old call sign deliberately. "Your communications hub has been compromised. Primary operator is down, secondary operator is down. Explosive charges are now under hostile control." The radio exploded with confused voices as team leaders tried to understand how their secure network had been penetrated. Margaret continued broadcasting, her voice cutting through the chaos with the authority of someone who'd spent years coordinating complex operations. "For the education of any surviving team members, you are not facing a civilian target. You have engaged a decorated intelligence operative with 847 confirmed eliminations and extensive experience in asymmetric warfare. Your operational security has been completely compromised. Your communications are under hostile control, and your explosive materials have been repurposed." Margaret was already moving as she spoke, carrying charges from the van toward positions that would be far more strategically valuable than breaching classroom doors. Her years of retirement hadn't dulled her tactical instincts. If anything, the personal stakes involved in protecting her chosen community had sharpened her focus to a level she'd never experienced during her official service. The first charge went under the black SUV positioned on Oak Street, configured as a mobility kill that would eliminate the team's primary escape route, while creating a distraction that would draw responding officers away from the school. The second charge found its way to the utility shed behind Fletcher's Cafe, where taking out the electrical transformer would complicate any backup plans that required coordinated timing. Through her commandeered radio, Margaret listened to the assault teams struggling to adapt to a situation that had spiraled completely beyond their original parameters. Professional contractors expected to face predictable resistance from local law enforcement, not to find themselves outmaneuvered by a target who understood their methods better than they did. "Orchid, this is Team Leader Alpha," a voice crackled. Through the radio. "We can negotiate withdrawal if you release our communications equipment." "Negative," Margaret replied, settling into a firing position that gave her overlapping fields of fire covering both remaining vehicles. "You brought military-grade weapons into a school zone. You targeted innocent children to flush out a single individual. There will be no negotiation and no withdrawal." She triggered the first charge remotely, and the SUV on Oak Street disappeared in a fireball that shook windows throughout the residential district. The explosion served multiple purposes. It eliminated the team's primary escape route, created the kind of dramatic distraction that would draw every emergency responder in 3 counties, and demonstrated to the remaining attackers that their opponent possessed both the capability and the will to escalate the engagement to whatever level was necessary. The second team, positioned near the school's rear entrance, began moving toward her last known position. But Margaret was no longer where they expected her to be. She'd relocated to the roof of the community center, where she had elevated sightlines covering the entire school property, and the approaching men had no idea they were walking into a carefully prepared ambush. Through the rifle scope, Margaret could see the children's faces in the classroom windows, pressed against glass they'd been told to stay away from, watching their quiet town transform into something from their worst nightmares. The sight filled her with a cold rage that had nothing to do with professional training and everything to do with the protective instincts that 12 years of civilian life had awakened in her. These men had made a fundamental miscalculation. They'd assumed that threatening the community she'd grown to love would force her to surrender or flee. Instead, they'd given her something worth fighting for that transcended any loyalty to flag or country or classified mission parameters. Margaret Thompson, the flower seller, was gone. In her place was Orchid, the ghost operative whose legend had been built on the simple principle that some lines should never be crossed. And the men who'd chosen to threaten children in pursuit of their objectives were about to learn exactly why her operational record had made her simultaneously the most valuable and most feared asset in the history of covert operations. The first counter-assault came from the north side of the school property, where 3 operators moved in textbook formation across the playground equipment. Margaret tracked them through her scope from her position on the community center roof, noting their professional spacing, their coordinated movement patterns, their systematic clearing of potential cover positions. These weren't the same caliber as the men she'd eliminated earlier. They moved with the precision of Tier 1 Special Operations personnel. Margaret's first shot dropped the point man beside the monkey bars, the subsonic round designed to minimize noise and muzzle flash. The other 2 immediately sought cover behind the metal slide structure, their training evident in how quickly they adapted to contact from an unexpected angle. Through her scope, Margaret could see them communicating with hand signals, coordinating their response to her firing position. The radio crackled with updated intelligence as the surviving team members processed the loss of their advance element. Orchids have an elevated position northeast of the primary target, sniper qualified, precision weapons. Recommend immediate relocation and close assault. Margaret was already moving before they finished speaking. Her years of operational experience had taught her that staying in one position after making contact was usually fatal, especially against opponents who understood counter-sniper tactics. She rappelled down the back wall of the community center using a climbing rope she'd positioned during her initial reconnaissance, landing in the alley that separated the building from the residential district. Her next position was the bell tower of St. Mark's Presbyterian Church, a 100-year-old stone structure that provided both elevation and protection from return fire. The climb was more challenging than the community center narrow interior stairs that hadn't been designed for rapid tactical movement, but the position offered sightlines, covering the entire school complex and most of the surrounding streets. From the bell tower, Margaret could see the full scope of the operation unfolding below her. Emergency responders were beginning to arrive from surrounding counties, but they were being funneled into positions that would actually increase the danger to civilians. The assault team had anticipated law enforcement response and was using their own vehicles and personnel as obstacles to prevent effective coordination between different agencies. Margaret keyed her commandeered radio, switching to the emergency frequency used by local law enforcement. "This is Margaret Thompson, calling for Detective Morrison or any senior officer on scene." Ray Morrison's voice came through the static, tight with stress and confusion. "Margaret, where the hell are you? We've got reports of explosions, gunfire, and now someone's barricaded inside the elementary school." "Ray, listen carefully," Margaret said, watching through her scope as two more operators attempted to breach the school's rear entrance. "The men attacking the school are not local threats. They're professional military contractors with advanced weapons and tactical training. Do not attempt to engage them directly with standard law enforcement protocols." "Margaret, how do you know this? And why does everyone seem to think you're involved?" Margaret fired twice in rapid succession, both rounds finding their targets as the two operators fell beside the school's rear doors. "Because I am involved, Ray. And right now, I'm the only thing standing between those children and people who view them as acceptable casualties." There was a long pause on the radio. When Ray's voice returned, it carried a different tone, the recognition that whatever he'd thought he knew about the quiet woman who sold flowers had been fundamentally wrong. "What do you need from us?" he asked. "Keep your officers back from the school perimeter," Margaret replied, already shifting position within the bell tower to acquire new targets. "These operators are using your response protocols against you. Every time you move personnel into their predetermined zones, you're giving them exactly what they want." Through the scope, Margaret watched as a white sedan approached the school from the east, moving too fast for civilian traffic and following a route that suggested intimate knowledge of local street patterns. This wasn't part of the original assault team. It was reinforcement, probably called in when the operation began failing to meet its timeline. The sedan disgorged 4 more operators, these ones carrying heavier weapons and wearing body armor that indicated they'd been prepared for extended engagement. Margaret recognized the equipment loadout from her years in intelligence operations. These were escalation specialists, brought in when subtlety had failed and overwhelming firepower became the primary objective. Margaret's position in the bell tower was becoming untenable. The stone walls provided excellent protection against small arms fire, but they also limited her mobility and created a potential trap if the opposition brought heavy weapons to bear against her position. She needed to relocate again, but doing so would temporarily break visual contact with the school and give the assault team opportunities to advance. She triggered the second explosive charge she'd positioned earlier, taking out the electrical transformer behind Fletcher's Cafe. The resulting power outage plunged half of Millbrook into darkness, disrupting whatever timing mechanisms the assault team had been using, and forcing them to rely on backup communication systems that Margaret could potentially intercept. The explosion also provided the distraction she needed to evacuate the bell tower. Margaret descended the stairs rapidly, her equipment secured for movement, her mind already calculating the next firing position that would give her optimal coverage of the school grounds. Her destination was the Millbrook Water Tower, a municipal structure that sat on elevated ground overlooking the entire town. The climb was exposed and dangerous, requiring her to cross open ground while potentially under observation from multiple hostile positions. But the water tower offered something no other position could provide: complete 360-degree visibility and firing lanes that covered every approach to the elementary school. Margaret's sprint across the exposed terrain drew immediate fire from at least 2 positions. Bullets sparked off the pavement around her feet, fragments of asphalt stinging her legs as she ran. The serpentine pattern that had kept her alive in a dozen different combat zones. She reached the water tower's ladder as automatic weapons fire chewed into the metal structure around her, the sound of ricochets mixing with the deeper percussion of high-velocity rounds. Striking steel, the climb was harrowing. 40 feet of vertical ladder while under fire from opponents who were rapidly zeroing in on her position. Margaret's hands and feet found purchase on rungs slick with morning dew. Her rifle slung across her back, her focus narrowed to the simple mechanics of movement under extreme duress. She reached the maintenance platform as a burst of automatic fire rang off the ladder just below her position. Through the metal grating, Margaret could see muzzle flashes from multiple positions around the school. The assault team had abandoned stealth entirely and was now engaging in direct fire combat in the middle of a residential neighborhood. From her elevated position, Margaret had a complete tactical picture for the first time since the engagement began. 7 operators remain, positioned at a rough perimeter around the school building. Emergency responders gathering at predetermined choke points that kept them away from effective intervention ranges. And most critically, she could see movement inside the school itself, shadowy figures in tactical gear who had somehow breached the building during the chaos of the exterior engagement. Margaret's blood went cold. While she'd been engaging the obvious threats outside, a separate team had infiltrated the school building itself. The children she'd been fighting to protect were no longer safe behind locked doors and reinforced walls. The threat was already inside with them. She keyed the radio, her voice cutting through the chatter of multiple agencies trying to coordinate response. All units, this is Orchid. Hostile forces have breached the primary structure. Repeat, the school building has been compromised. Margaret's scope swept across the school's windows, looking for any sign of the infiltration team. The building's interior was mostly dark, emergency lighting providing only minimal illumination. But in one second-floor window, she caught a brief glimpse of movement tactical gear. Assault rifle, someone moving with purpose through what should have been an empty corridor. Her shot was nearly impossible, 200 meters, through glass, at a moving target in low light conditions. But Margaret had made similar shots under worse conditions, and now she had something she'd never had during her official operations. Absolute moral clarity about what she was fighting for. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and through the scope she saw the figure in the window stumble and fall. But there were others. She could see them moving through the building now, working their way systematically through corridors toward the secured areas where teachers had gathered their students. Margaret began rapid precision shooting. Each round carefully placed to interdict movement through the school without risking harm to any children who might be in adjacent areas. It was the most challenging shooting of her entire career, requiring her to account for glass deflection, interior wall penetration, and the possibility that innocent people might be in her line of fire. The return fire was immediate and intense. The operators outside the school had finally identified her position on the water tower, and they were concentrating their efforts to eliminate her. Bullets struck the steel structure around her with sounds like hammer blows, each impact vibrating. Through the metal platform where she lay prone, Margaret's position was being systematically destroyed around her. Chunks of metal flew from the water tank itself, punctures allowing thousands of gallons to pour out in streaming cascades that soaked the platform and made footing treacherous. Her rifle scope had spiderwebbed from a near miss, forcing her to rely on iron sights for precision work, but she continued firing, each shot calculated to maximum effect. The operators inside the school were finding their movement restricted as Margaret's interdicting fire forced them to take cover, slowing their advance toward the areas where the children were sheltered. Through the radio chatter, Margaret learned that FBI tactical teams were finally approaching Millbrook, but their estimated arrival time was still 23 minutes away. She had to hold her position and maintain suppressive fire for almost half an hour while under concentrated assault from professional operators who had every advantage except her elevated position and superior marksmanship. Margaret's ammunition was running low, her rifle was damaged from fragments, and her position was becoming untenable as the water tower's structural integrity deteriorated under sustained fire. But every minute she held the infiltration team in place was another minute for the children to remain safe in their secured areas. She triggered her final explosive charge, the one she'd positioned under the remaining assault vehicle. The explosion rocked the entire neighborhood, taking out power lines and creating a massive distraction that temporarily disrupted the coordinated fire against her position. In the momentary lull, Margaret could hear something that gave her more hope than any tactical advantage: the distant sound of helicopter rotors approaching fast from the south. Federal response was finally arriving in force, and the men who had chosen to threaten children in pursuit of their objectives were about to face the full weight of American law enforcement's most elite units. But Margaret knew she couldn't wait for rescue. The infiltration team inside the school was still moving, still advancing toward innocent children who had no defense except a retired operative, whose body was beginning to fail under the sustained stress of combat she hadn't experienced in over a decade. She began preparing for what she knew might be her final tactical decision, abandoning her overwatch position to enter the school building directly, where the fight would become close-quarters combat in narrow corridors filled with the people she'd spent 12 years protecting through quiet service and genuine care. Margaret's descent from the compromised water tower was a controlled fall through cascading water and twisted metal. The structure groaned ominously as her weight shifted from the damaged platform to the maintenance ladder, each rung threatening to give way under the combined stress of sustained gunfire and structural failure. Water from the punctured tank soaked through her tactical gear, making every surface slippery and treacherous. She hit the ground hard, rolling to absorb the impact as bullets sparked off the concrete around her. The rifle she'd used for precision shooting was ruined, the scope destroyed, the barrel warped from a direct hit that had nearly taken her head off. But Margaret had prepared for this contingency. Hidden in the utility shed behind the water tower were backup weapons she'd cached years earlier, insurance against the day her past might catch up with her civilian life. The shed's interior was cramped and dark, filled with municipal maintenance equipment that provided perfect camouflage for her emergency supplies. Margaret's hands found the waterproof case automatically, muscle memory guiding her to equipment she'd hoped never to use again. Inside were weapons designed for close-quarters combat, a compact assault rifle with collapsible stock, ceramic body armor that would stop rifle rounds, and enough ammunition to sustain a prolonged engagement. As she geared up, Margaret's radio crackled with transmissions from the infiltration team inside the school. They were communicating in a mixture of English and what sounded like Eastern European phrases, their voices tight with frustration as they reported their inability to locate the children. The teachers had done their job well following lockdown protocols that kept students hidden in interior rooms away from windows and main corridors. Margaret knew those protocols wouldn't hold forever. Professional operators would eventually breach the secured areas, and when that happened, innocent children would become bargaining chips in a negotiation where Margaret held very few cards. She had perhaps 5 minutes before the situation inside the school deteriorated beyond any possibility of resolution. Margaret's approach to the school building was different from anything she'd done during her operational career. In her official missions, she'd been trained to neutralize targets efficiently, while minimizing risk to herself and completing strategic objectives. Now she was motivated by something far more primal, the absolute need to protect innocent lives, regardless of cost to herself. The school's main entrance had been barricaded from the inside, metal security doors that would take precious time to breach. Instead, Margaret headed for the gymnasium's emergency exit, a door she knew from 12 years of attending school events and community gatherings. The lock yielded to techniques she'd learned in training courses that officially didn't exist, and she slipped inside the building that had been transformed from a place of learning into a combat zone. The interior of Millbrook Elementary was eerily quiet, emergency lighting casting strange shadows down hallways that should have been filled with children's voices. Margaret moved with practiced silence, her footsteps muffled by years of training in building clearance techniques. But she wasn't clearing the building in the traditional sense. She was hunting people who had chosen to threaten children. And that changed everything about her approach. Her first contact came at the intersection of the main hallway and the corridor leading to the primary grades. A single operator was positioned as overwatch, his attention focused on monitoring the approaches to the area where most of the children were sheltered. He never saw Margaret coming. Her approach was silent, her elimination swift and professional, her movement past his position seamless. Through the dead man's radio, Margaret listened to increasingly frustrated transmissions from his teammates. They'd found the secured areas but were unable to breach doors that had been reinforced specifically to prevent exactly this type of intrusion. The teachers inside were following protocols that required them to maintain lockdown, regardless of what they heard outside their doors. Margaret knew the school's layout intimately, where the secured rooms were located, how the ventilation system connected different areas, which walls were structural and which were merely partitions. This knowledge gave her advantages the infiltration team couldn't match, even with their detailed floor plans and professional training. She began moving through the building systematically, using maintenance passages and service corridors that didn't appear on standard architectural drawings. Her objective wasn't just to eliminate the immediate threats, it was to create enough confusion and casualties among the infiltration team that they would abandon their mission and attempt to withdraw. The second operator was positioned near the library, where kindergarten classes had been moved during the lockdown. Margaret's approach was through the book stacks, using the metal shelving for concealment as she closed distance. The engagement was close quarters and violent, ending with the operator's weapon in Margaret's hands and his radio providing intelligence about his teammates' positions. "Base, this is Sierra 2, she transmitted, mimicking the dead man's voice. "Patterns, possible breach in Sector 4. Requesting backup to investigate." The response came immediately. "Sierra 2, maintain position. Sierra 3 is moving to your location." Margaret smiled grimly as she prepared an ambush in the library's reading area. Professional operators were trained to respond to specific threats and tactical situations, but they weren't prepared for an opponent who understood their methods well enough to manipulate their own protocols against them. Sierra 3 arrived expecting to find his teammate investigating a potential breach. Instead, he found Margaret waiting behind the circulation desk, her weapon trained on the doorway. He'd been funneled through. The engagement lasted less than 3 seconds, ending with another enemy radio under Margaret's control and more intelligence about their remaining positions. The infiltration team was down to 2 operators, both now aware that they were facing someone far more capable than the civilian target they'd been briefed to expect. Their radio chatter had shifted from professional coordination to barely controlled panic as they realized their teammates were being systematically eliminated by an opponent who seemed to know the building better than they did. Margaret's final approach was through the ventilation system, a route that would bring her directly above the main hallway, where the last 2 operators were attempting to coordinate their withdrawal. The ductwork was cramped and noisy, but it provided access to positions that would be impossible to reach through normal movement. She emerged from a ceiling access panel directly behind the 2 remaining threats, dropping into the hallway with weapons ready. The engagement was swift and decisive. 2 trained professionals eliminated before they could react to an approach they'd never anticipated. The sudden silence that followed was almost overwhelming after the sustained violence. of the past hour. Margaret stood in the hallway of Millbrook Elementary, surrounded by the tools of her former trade, breathing hard from exertion and adrenaline. Through the building's walls, she could hear the distant sound of helicopter rotors growing louder. As federal response teams finally arrived in force, but her mission wasn't complete. The children were still locked in their secured areas, still terrified and traumatized by sounds of gunfire in their school. Margaret keyed the school's intercom system, her voice carrying through every classroom and hallway in the building. "This is Margaret Thompson," she said, her tone calm and reassuring despite everything that had just occurred. "The building is secure. Teachers, please maintain a lockdown until federal agents arrive to escort you out. Children, you are safe. Now the bad people are gone and help is coming." Margaret walked toward the main entrance, where she could see tactical vehicles positioning outside. Her weapons were secured but visible. She knew that federal agents would be entering the building prepared for continued combat, and she needed to present herself in a way that wouldn't result in friendly fire incidents. The main doors burst open as FBI tactical teams flooded into the building, their movements professional and coordinated as they began clearing rooms and securing the area. Margaret stood in the center of the main hallway, hands visible, weapons lowered, waiting for the inevitable confrontation with authorities who would have many questions about how a flower shop owner had single-handedly neutralized a professional assault team. The team leader approached her cautiously, his weapon ready but not directly threatening. "Ma'am, I need you to slowly place your weapons on the floor and step away from them." Margaret complied, her movements deliberate and non-threatening. "The building is clear," she said. 7 hostiles eliminated, no injuries to civilians or school personnel. Teachers and students are secured in designated safe areas per school lockdown protocols. "And you are?" the team leader asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "Margaret Thompson," she replied, "also known as Orchid, retired intelligence operative. The people who attacked the school were here because of May." The admission carried weight that went beyond simple identification. Margaret was acknowledging responsibility not just for her actions during the engagement, but for the entire situation that had put innocent children at risk. She was prepared to face whatever consequences followed from the choices she'd made to protect her community. But as federal agents began the process of securing the scene and documenting what had occurred, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced during her operational career: the satisfaction of fighting for something that mattered more than strategic objectives or classified missions. She had protected the people who'd given her life meaning, and regardless of what happened next, that was worth whatever price she might be required to pay. Outside the school, the sound of children's voices began to filter through the building as evacuation procedures commenced under federal supervision. Parents were gathering at designated areas, emergency counselors were being positioned to help with trauma response, and the community of Millbrook was beginning the process of understanding how their quiet town had become the site of a military-style assault. Margaret stood in the hallway where she'd made her final stand, surrounded by federal agents who were trying to piece together how a woman who sold flowers had managed to single-handedly defeat a professional assault team. The answer was complex, involving years of training and operational experience that most people would never understand. But the simple truth was that when innocent people were threatened, particularly children, Margaret had discovered reserves of determination and capability that transcended anything she'd accessed during her official service. She'd found something worth fighting for that went beyond duty or orders. She'd found a cause that justified using every skill she'd ever learned in service of protecting the community that had become her true home. 6 weeks after the assault on Millbrook Elementary, Margaret sat in a nondescript conference room in a federal building whose location wasn't marked on any public maps. Across from her were people whose names she would never learn. representing agencies whose existence was barely acknowledged even in classified briefings. The debriefing had taken 3 days, covering not just the events in Millbrook but her entire operational history, 847 confirmed eliminations, dozens of covert missions, intelligence operations that had shaped geopolitical outcomes in ways the public would never understand. The lead interrogator, a woman in her 40s with the kind of precise appearance that suggested military background, closed a thick file and looked directly at Margaret. "Your actions in Millbrook have created what our analysts are calling a classification nightmare," she said. "A retired operative with your operational history engaging in domestic combat operations, regardless of circumstances, raises questions that reach the highest levels of government." Margaret met her gaze steadily. "Are you asking me to apologize for protecting innocent children? We're asking you to understand the larger implications," another voice interjected from the end of the table. This one belonged to a man whose suit cost more than most people's cars, suggesting he represented interests beyond standard government agencies. "Your cover identity wasn't just protection for you, it was protection for operations, methods, and personnel that remain classified at levels beyond your former clearance." The conversation that followed was a complex negotiation that had less to do with Margaret's actions and more to do with how those actions would be explained to a public that had witnessed something unprecedented. A small-town flower seller had single-handedly defeated a military-style assault team, saving dozens of children in the process. That story couldn't be allowed to exist in its true form without exposing classified programs and operational methods that had taken decades to develop. Margaret understood the game being played. She'd been part of similar conversations from the other side, helping to craft cover stories that protected national security while managing public perception of events that couldn't be fully disclosed. But now she was the problem that needed to be managed, the variable that didn't fit into neat compartments of classification and deniability. "What are you proposing?" she asked. The woman with the military bearing slid a document across the table. "Margaret Thompson dies in a car accident 3 days ago, en route to visit relatives in another state. There will be a funeral, attended by people from Millbrook who genuinely mourn the loss of their beloved flower shop owner. Her body was too damaged for viewing, so there will be a closed casket service." Margaret scanned the paperwork, recognizing the thoroughness of a complete identity termination. Birth certificate revisions, social security records, financial accounts, every trace of Margaret Thompson's existence would be systematically erased, replaced by a narrative that explained her sudden absence without raising questions about what had really happened and the alternative identity. She asked, knowing there had to be one. People like her didn't just disappear. They were too valuable to waste, too dangerous to leave unaccounted for. Sarah Mitchell, recently retired federal agent, relocating to a small town in Oregon to recover from injuries sustained in the line of duty, the woman replied. Background in crisis management and emergency response, which explains any unusual capabilities you might display. A quiet life, but one that keeps you available for consultation on matters where your expertise might be valuable. It was a generous offer by the standards of the intelligence community. Complete identity protection, financial security, and the freedom to live a normal life with the understanding that she might occasionally be called upon for advice or analysis. Most retired operatives received far less accommodation when their covers were blown. But Margaret was thinking about something else entirely. What about Millbrook? What happens to the people there? The expensive suit spoke again. The official story is a terrorist attack by a domestic extremist group, thwarted by the heroic actions of federal law enforcement. The community will receive counseling services, financial assistance for any damages, and enhanced security measures. They'll recover. And they'll remember Margaret Thompson as a victim, not as the person who saved them. Margaret felt something twist in her chest at the thought. The people who'd become her family over 12 years would mourn someone who never existed, while never knowing that the quiet woman who remembered their anniversaries and special occasions had been willing to die to protect their children. Harold Peterson would bring flowers to a grave that contained nothing. Emma Richardson would grow up believing that the woman who'd taught her about resilience and responsibility had been just another casualty. "I need to see them," Margaret said. "Before Margaret Thompson dies, I need to see my friends one more time." The woman shook her head. "That's not possible. Margaret Thompson left town 3 days ago, remember? She's already gone as far as anyone in Millbrook knows." But Margaret had spent too many years in the intelligence community to accept that kind of bureaucratic finality. "Then arrange it differently. A federal agent conducting follow-up interviews. Someone who needs to speak with community members about their experiences during the crisis. Give me 1 day to say goodbye, even if they don't understand that's what I'm doing." The negotiation that followed took another hour. But Margaret had advantages in dealing with intelligence bureaucracy that most people lacked. She understood which arguments would be persuasive, which officials had authority to make exceptions, and how to frame requests in terms of operational security rather than personal sentiment. 2 days later, Special Agent Sarah Mitchell knocked on the door of Peterson Flowers, the temporary shop that Harold Peterson had opened in the weeks following Margaret's apparent death. Harold had taken over her customer base, honoring orders that Margaret had placed, maintaining relationships with suppliers, keeping alive the business that had been the heart of her cover identity. "Mr. Peterson," Margaret said, showing credentials that were completely legitimate even though the person carrying them technically didn't exist yet. "I'm conducting follow-up interviews about the events at the school. I understand you knew Margaret Thompson well." Harold's face immediately softened at the mention of Margaret's name. "She was the finest woman I ever knew, except for my Patricia," he said, inviting her into the shop that smelled of roses and possibility. "Had a way of making everyone feel like family. The whole town's been lost without her." For the next hour, Margaret listened to Harold talk about Margaret Thompson, the woman he'd known, the difference she'd made in his life, the hole her death had left in the community. It was surreal, hearing her own life described by someone who genuinely loved her, understanding for the first time how completely she'd succeeded in becoming the person she'd pretended to be. Similar conversations followed throughout the day. Dr. Sarah Webb spoke about Margaret's quiet generosity and her uncanny ability to remember every patient's favorite flowers. Emma Richardson, now 17 and working part-time at the temporary flower shop, talked about the woman who'd taught her that paying attention to details wasn't just about being careful. It was about caring enough to notice what mattered to other people. Ray Morrison was the most difficult conversation. The detective had spent weeks trying to piece together what had really happened during the assault, and his questions suggested he suspected that the official story was incomplete. But he also seemed to understand that some questions were better left unasked, some answers too dangerous to pursue. "Margaret Thompson was a mystery," he said finally. "Quiet woman who never talked about her past, but who seemed to know things about the world that don't come from selling flowers. I always figured she'd lived through something that made her want peace more than most people. I just never imagined she'd be willing to give up that peace to protect the rest of us." As the day ended, Margaret found herself standing in the cemetery, where Margaret Thompson's memorial service had been held. The headstone was simple, bearing the name and dates that had defined her civilian identity, surrounded by flowers that Harold, Emma, and dozens of other community members had placed there in genuine grief for someone they'd loved. Margaret knelt beside the grave marker, thinking about the woman who'd lived for 12 years in Millbrook, who'd found meaning in small acts of service, who'd discovered that protecting innocent people was worth any sacrifice. That woman had been real, even if her identity documents had been fabricated. The relationships had been genuine, even if the background story had been constructed by intelligence analysts. "Thank you," she whispered to the headstone, not sure if she was addressing the woman she'd been, the community that had sheltered her, or the circumstances that had allowed her to discover who she really was beneath all the layers of operational training and classified experience. 3 days later, Sarah Mitchell moved into a small house in the coastal town of Brookings, Oregon. She opened a consulting business specializing in crisis management and emergency response, work that allowed her to use her skills in service of communities that needed protection from threats they didn't understand. The business card she had printed was simple: Sarah Mitchell, security consultant, protecting what matters most. Local residents found her to be a quiet woman who seemed to know a lot about flowers, who remembered everyone's names and important dates, who had an uncanny ability to spot potential problems before they became serious threats. She volunteers at the local elementary school, teaching children about emergency preparedness and personal safety. She never spoke about her past, but neighbors noticed that she always seemed to know when someone needed help. On quiet evenings, Sarah would tend the garden behind her house, growing roses and carnations and the other flowers she'd learned to love during her years as Margaret Thompson. Sometimes she would think about Harold Peterson, who'd taken over her customer relationships with the same care she'd always shown. Sometimes she thought about Emma Richardson, who was applying to colleges and would probably never know that her quiet mentor had been someone whose official death count exceeded the population of most small towns. But mostly, Sarah Mitchell, formerly Margaret Thompson, formerly Orchid, thought about the lesson she'd learned in Millbrook, that the most important battles aren't fought for strategic objectives or classified missions, but for the simple right of innocent people to live there. Lives without fear. She'd spent her operational career serving her country through violence carefully applied in the shadows. But it was only when she'd been willing to fight openly for people she genuinely loved that she'd discovered what service really meant. Official records would show that Margaret Thompson died in a car accident, mourned by a community that never knew her true identity. But the woman who'd been willing to sacrifice everything to protect their children lived on, continuing her mission under a different name in a different place, still watching, still protecting, still finding meaning in the quiet service of keeping innocent people safe from threats they would never see coming. In the end, the number 847 had been just a statistic in a classified file. What mattered was the number of lives she'd chosen to save, the community she'd protected, the children who could grow up safely, because someone had been willing to stand between them and the darkness that existed in a world they were too young to understand. Sarah Mitchell, security consultant, had found her true calling not in the official missions that had made her a legend in intelligence circles, but in the simple commitment to ensure that evil would never go unopposed while she had breath to fight against it. 5 years had passed since Sarah Mitchell settled in Brookings, Oregon, and the quiet coastal community had embraced her as thoroughly as Millbrook once had Margaret Thompson. Her security consulting business had grown beyond her expectations, not through aggressive marketing, but through word-of-mouth recommendations from clients who'd experienced the difference between adequate protection and the kind of comprehensive safety planning that came from decades of real-world experience. Sarah's morning routine still began before dawn, but now it included a walk along Chetco Beach, where the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly toward horizons that had once seemed impossibly distant during her operational years. The salt air cleared her mind in ways that no amount of tactical planning ever had, reminding her daily that some battles were worth fighting not for victory, but for the simple preservation of beauty in a world too often consumed by conflict. Her phone rang as she returned from the beach, the caller ID showing a number she recognized as belonging to Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the principal of Brookings Elementary. It was unusual for Jenny to call this early, and the tension in her voice immediately put Sarah on alert. "Sarah, I'm sorry to bother you so early, but we have a situation developing," Jenny said. "There's been some unusual activity around the school over the past few days." Strangers asking questions about security procedures, taking photographs of the building layout. The police say it's probably nothing, but after what happened in Millbrook 5 years ago. Jenny's voice trailed off. She didn't know that Sarah Mitchell had any connection to the events in Pennsylvania, but the Millbrook school shooting had become a case study in crisis response throughout the education community. Every principal in America had studied the incident, analyzing how proper lockdown procedures and community preparation had prevented what could have been a catastrophic loss of life. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Sarah said. "And Jenny? Until I arrive, I want you to implement modified security protocols. Nothing that would alarm the children, but increased awareness among staff. Can you do that?" "Already done," Jenny replied. "Sarah, I know you've never talked about your background, but you've taught us enough about threat assessment that we recognize the patterns. Whatever's happening, we're as ready as we can be." Sarah's drive to the school took her through the heart of Brookings, past businesses and homes where she'd built relationships as genuine as those she'd formed in Millbrook. There was Murphy's Hardware, where old Tom Murphy had become like a father to her, never asking about her past, but always offering advice about everything from garden irrigation to home security. There was Coastal Blooms, the flower shop where she'd become friends with owner Lisa Chun, sharing techniques for arranging flowers that Lisa assumed came from years of hobby work rather than operational training in creating natural camouflage. At Brookings Elementary, Sarah conducted a systematic assessment that took 2 hours and covered every aspect of the school's physical security, personnel protocols, and emergency response capabilities. What she found confirmed Jenny's instincts. The surveillance had been professional, conducted by people who understood school security measures and were specifically looking for vulnerabilities in the system. "It's not random," Sarah told Jenny, as they sat in the principal's office, reviewing the photographic evidence that staff members had quietly gathered. "Someone is conducting advanced reconnaissance for a possible operation. The question is whether we're dealing with a specific threat against the school, or whether you're being evaluated as part of a larger target selection process." Jenny paled slightly. "You mean there might be other schools they're looking at?" "It's possible," Sarah said. "The methodology suggests they're being very deliberate about site selection. They want a target that will generate maximum media attention while presenting manageable tactical challenges." What Sarah didn't say was that the surveillance techniques reminded her of methods used by the same type of contractors who had attacked Millbrook. Professional, systematic, designed to gather intelligence for an operation that would be executed with military precision. The possibility that her past was catching up with her again made her chest tighten, but she pushed the concern aside to focus on the immediate threat. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from a number she didn't recognize. "Orchids still. Flies high in Oregon gardens. Colleagues would like to arrange viewing of rare blooms. Mutually beneficial consultation opportunity." The message was obviously coded, using terminology that confirmed her suspicions about who might be behind the school surveillance. Someone from her past was reaching out, suggesting a meeting that would supposedly benefit both parties. But Sarah had learned enough about intelligence community euphemisms to understand that mutually beneficial consultation often meant do what we want or face consequences. She deleted the message and immediately began implementing contingency plans she'd hoped never to use. Her first call was to a secure number that connected to the same federal oversight system she'd dealt with after Millbrook. The conversation was brief and professional, but it confirmed what she'd already suspected. Her location was known, her current identity was compromised, and people were using that information to pressure her into cooperation. "Sarah Mitchell has 48 hours to respond to the consultation request," the voice on the other end told her. "Failure to engage will result in reassessment of current arrangement." Sarah understood the threat. Her protected status, her new identity, Her quiet life in Brookings, all of it existed at the pleasure of people who viewed her as an asset rather than a person. If she didn't cooperate with whatever operation they had in mind, she would lose everything she'd built for the second time in her life. But as she looked out the window of Jenny's office at children playing on the school playground, Sarah realized that some things had become more important than personal security. These kids deserved the same protection she'd provided to the children of Millbrook, regardless of what it might cost her. That evening, Sarah called a community at the Pastijo, Brookings Community Center. She'd never used her security consulting credentials to organize something this public, but the situation demanded transparency rather than the shadowy maneuvering that had defined too much of her life. Nearly 200 people attended, parents, teachers, local business owners, city officials, and residents who'd come to respect Sarah's expertise over the past 5 years. She stood before them, knowing that what she was about to say would fundamentally change their perception of who she was and why she'd come to their community. 5 years ago, I moved to Brookings to start a new life, she began. I told people I was a retired federal agent, and that was true. What I didn't mention was the nature of my federal service, or the reasons why starting over had become necessary. Sarah spent the next hour telling them a carefully edited version of her story, enough truth to explain the current threat, enough omissions to protect classified information and operational details. She told them about Millbrook, about Margaret Thompson, about the choice between running from danger and standing to protect innocent people. The same kind of people who attacked Millbrook are now conducting surveillance on your school, she said. I don't know their specific objectives, but I know their methods. They're professionals who view civilian casualties as acceptable costs in achieving their goals. The questions that followed were exactly what Sarah had expected. Why had she hidden her background? What made her certain the threat was real? What could the community do to protect their children? Tom Murphy stood up in the back of the room, his weathered hands gripping his hat. Sarah, in 5 years you've never asked us for anything except the chance to be helpful. You've taught our kids about safety. You've helped our businesses prepare for emergencies. You've been there every time someone needed assistance. If you say there's a threat, that's good enough for me. What do you need us to do? The response from the rest of the community was immediate and overwhelming. These people had learned to trust Sarah's judgment through years of consistent, reliable service. They didn't need to understand the complexities of her past to know that she'd earned the right to ask for their help in protecting their children. Over the next 24 hours, Brookings implemented security measures that would have impressed military planners. Parents organized volunteer patrols around school grounds. Local business owners contributed equipment and expertise. The police department coordinated with county and state authorities to establish expanded response protocols. Most importantly, the community demonstrated the kind of unified purpose that makes professional operations far more difficult to execute successfully. Sarah's phone rang at exactly 48 hours after the first coded message. The same anonymous voice, but now with a different tone, frustrated, almost angry. Orchid, your community mobilization has created complications for planned operations, the voice said. This level of civilian involvement was not anticipated. Then you don't understand what communities can accomplish when they're properly motivated, Sarah replied. The consultation you requested is declined. Find a different approach to whatever objective you're pursuing. Sarah Mitchell's protected status is hereby terminated, the voice responded. Federal oversight is withdrawn. You're on your own. I've been on my own since I chose to protect children instead of preserving operational security, Sarah said. The difference is that now I have a community that chooses to stand with me. Sarah ended the call and looked out her window at Brookings Elementary, where children were arriving for another normal day of learning and growing, protected by a network of adults who decided that some things were worth defending regardless of personal cost. Over the following weeks, The surveillance around the school gradually diminished and eventually disappeared entirely. Whether the threat had been neutralized by community vigilance or simply redirected toward easier targets, Sarah couldn't be certain. But she'd learned something important about the relationship between individual courage and collective strength. 6 months later, Sarah received a package with no return address. Inside was a newspaper clipping from the Millbrook Gazette, reporting on the 5th anniversary memorial service for victims of the school attack. The article mentioned that Margaret Thompson's grave remained one of the most visited sites in the community cemetery, still decorated with fresh flowers brought by people who remembered her kindness and generosity. Harold Peterson, now 87 years old, was quoted in the article. Margaret taught us that paying attention to details isn't just about being careful, it's about caring enough to notice what matters to other people. That's a lesson worth remembering, especially when the world seems full of folks who've forgotten how to care about their neighbors. Sarah smiled as she read the words, recognizing the influence of conversations she'd had with Harold during the final day she'd spent in Millbrook. The ideas she'd shared as Margaret Thompson were still alive, still influencing how people treated each other, still making the world a little bit better through this simple act of genuine attention to others' needs. That evening, Sarah tended her garden as the Pacific sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The roses were blooming beautifully, their petals perfect for the arrangements she would create tomorrow for the retirement party of a local teacher, the wedding reception of a young couple who'd met in her security preparedness class, and the memorial service for an elderly woman who'd been like a grandmother to half the children in Brookings. In the distance, she could hear children playing in the neighborhood streets, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze, the sound of innocence preserved, of safety maintained, of communities that understood their responsibility to protect what mattered most. Margaret Thompson had been a legend with 847 confirmed eliminations. But Sarah Mitchell had discovered something more valuable than any operational record: the knowledge that protecting innocent people was not just a duty, but a privilege that gave life meaning beyond any classification level or strategic objective. The number that really mattered wasn't 847. It was the countless children who would grow up safely because someone had been willing to stand between them and the darkness, someone who understood that the most important battles are fought not for victory, but for the simple preservation of hope in a world that desperately needed people willing to care about their neighbors. As stars appeared in the darkening sky above the Oregon coast, Sarah Mitchell, former intelligence operative, former flower seller, current guardian of community safety, smiled and went inside to prepare for another day of serving people who deserved protection, whether they knew it or not. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.